I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. The question is, in your discussion with Dr. Anna Lembke, you were talking about abstaining from people's drug of choice for 30 days to reset the dopamine reward pathway. And indeed, that is the prescriptive that Dr. Anna Lembke gives for most all addictions and for people that are suffering from mild or even severe depression related to dopamine-seeking behaviors, social media, video games, sex, food, etc. However, of course, in the instance of food or in some other addictions, you can't abstain for 30 days, right? That would be terrible to abstain for food for 30 days. I'm sure people have done it, but it is not healthy to do. Certain things like alcohol and drugs, people can abstain for 30 days in efforts to never go back to them again. There are cases of severe alcohol or opiate dependence where people can't go cold turkey or they risk dying. So there they need to really work with a physician. But the 30-day reset of the dopamine system is something that's very real, and that pertains to most people. That is, it's going to be very effective for most people struggling with either behavioral, what are sometimes called process addictions, or other types of addictions, including substance abuse issues. The question continues. You said you were going to ask Anna how to abstain if your drug of choice is a thought or narrative as opposed to a substance or a behavior. Would you be able to discuss strategies for abstaining from addictive thoughts and narratives? Okay, so let's talk about intrusive thoughts, and let's start off by asking ourselves, what is a thought? Okay, in the realm of neurobiology, we have sensations, which are the processes by which our neurons, nerve cells, convert light, photons, sound waves, touch, mechanical pressure, etc., into electrical signals and chemical signals that head into our nervous system, including our brain, and then our brain, at least we think, makes sense of them and help us navigate the world that we're in. Okay, so the sensation part is a pure transformation of mechanical information, or in some cases, chemical information like smell, chemicals, literally volatile chemicals floating around in the world are brought into your nose, and your neurons in your olfactory bulb convert those into electrical and chemical signals that your brain can understand. Perceptions are your idea of what those signals out in the world are. Either because you're paying attention to them or for some other reason, you decide that a stop sign in front of you is red and that the sign behind it is white and that the sky is blue or cloudy. Those are perceptions. Okay, so we have sensations and perceptions. Then we have emotions, which are these things that include the mind and body that are related to neuromodulators like dopamine, serotonin, etc., although those chemicals do other things as well. And then, of course, we have behaviors, actions, everything from me moving my pen on a piece of paper to walking, running, etc. Thoughts are a fifth category of neural functioning that we really need to define, but that doesn't have as strict a definition as sensations, perceptions, or feeling, or action. But thoughts are real, right? We all know this. Thoughts are real. And one way that we can define thoughts is that thoughts are perceptions that include data from the past, present, or future, okay? Or combinations of past and present, or present and future, or future and past. Okay, I'm not trying to give an overly complicated definition here, but if we are going to answer a question about how to abstain from thoughts in a really direct and actionable way, we really need to address what are thoughts. So thoughts are perceptions that are generated internally, right? We don't need any external sensation in order to have a thought. We can close our eyes. We could be in sensory isolation for that matter. We could even be floating with no gravity, and we can have a thought. Thoughts tend to run pretty much automatically in the background all the time. Some people refer to this as chatter in the back of our minds in a very unstructured way. And then if we force our thoughts to be structured because we decide they need to be, or if something in our environment captures our perception, then our thoughts tend to be structured. Let me give you an example. If I'm just walking around, if there were a way in which we could broadcast my thoughts onto a screen, I hope we wouldn't do that, but those thoughts would be a mixture of semi-complete sentences and gibberish. However, if somebody stops me and says, "Hi, good to see you. What are you doing today?" and I start answering, well, then my thoughts are suddenly being driven by an external stimulus, their question, and some internal ideas, memory of who I am and what I'm doing that day, so past and present, and so on. And so thoughts become structured. So when we have a question about how to abstain from thoughts, we need to be additionally specific and really pinpoint that what we're trying to do is to abstain from thoughts we don't want, presumably, either because they are too repetitive and distracting, or because what's contained in those thoughts is disturbing. Okay. This is important because it gives us two answers to the questions that are highly divergent. One answer to the question of how to abstain from intrusive thoughts, thoughts that we're addicted to, is if those thoughts are merely on loop all the time and we can't stop them, but the thoughts themselves aren't particularly disturbing. So think about a song you can't get out of your head, or you keep recounting some event, but the event itself isn't very disturbing. It's just intrusive because it's there. Well, in that case, the data really point to trying to anchor your thoughts to some external stimulus. So getting into action, getting into activities that really draw your attention away from that thought. Now, you may still hear it scrolling in the background. So you might be sitting in class still hearing that loop of thoughts in the background. That's something that over time ought to wane. It ought to disappear. If we try and bring more and more attention to whatever it is that's in our environment, whatever it is that we happen to be learning or doing physically, etc. Things like mindful meditation, doing a 10 or even just 5-minute a day practice of sitting with eyes closed or lying down with eyes closed and really focusing on one's breath, focusing one's attention on sometimes it's called the third eye center, but in science, we'd say just the region right behind the forehead, you're directing your attention there, has been shown to increase focus for singular topics and can improve memory and do a bunch of other things as well. Those are data from Dr. Wendy Suzuki's lab at New York University. She was a guest on the podcast as well. My laboratory has run studies on mindful meditation as well. So what you're really trying to do is learn how to focus better on one thing. And by focusing on that one thing, you focus off these repetitive thoughts. Now, I have a feeling that this question was asked and that many people upvoted this question because the issue isn't just thoughts that are intrusive because they're there and on repeat, but because the thoughts themselves are actually troubling. This could be recounting a trauma, someone harmed you, you observed something that was disturbing, you felt wronged, you felt someone else was wronged, you can't seem to get your mind off of something and your emotions tend to follow. And so it's uncomfortable. I have a feeling this is the root of the question. In that case, the approach is very different. What we know from essentially all of the quality scientific and clinical studies is that those sorts of intrusive thoughts are very much like a trauma. Now, we have to be clear in defining what trauma is. I'll use the definition that Dr. Paul Conti, another incredible guest that was on our podcast, a psychiatrist, Stanford, Harvard-trained psychiatrist, I think one of the world's foremost leaders on the issue of trauma and psychiatry and psychology generally. He defines trauma as an event or something that fundamentally changes the way that your nervous system works such that you function less adaptively going forward from that event. Okay, so not every bad occurrence in your life is a trauma. That's good news. The bad news is many people have traumas, and traumas change the way that our nervous system works so that we don't function as well as we could. So in that sense, intrusive thoughts that are disturbing are in many ways traumas and are reinforcing that trauma. Now we know that almost counterintuitively, in order to deal with trauma, you have to get very close to that trauma. You don't have to re-expose, and I would hope you would not re-expose yourself to the very same trauma. But we know that one of the best ways to deal with traumas is to get very clear about the narrative around those traumas. Now, this can be done with a therapist, ideally, but not everyone has access to therapy or can afford therapy. But it turns out that if you want to extinguish an intrusive thought, one of the best ways to do that is to journal about that particular thought extensively. So rather than the earlier strategy for intrusive thoughts where they're just on loop and intrusive because they're on loop and present, but their content isn't disturbing, when a thought is disturbing and intrusive, we know that it's very useful to script out as much detail about that particular thought and the things around it as possible. Obviously, you want to do this in a way that is fairly structured. So you ideally would use complete sentences. So
the reason for doing that is that thoughts, as I mentioned earlier, can often be fragmentary. So they pop up in our mind almost seemingly spontaneously. They're inhibiting our ability to focus or be present to work or family or other things or sleep. Writing things down in a lot of detail does seem to have this quality of both reducing the emotional load of whatever it is that thought is about, as well as diminishing the frequency of those intrusive thoughts over time. So this is far and away different than the strategy I mentioned for the other types of intrusive thoughts. And really, it's far and away different from the 30-day abstinence approach that Dr. Anna Lembke was talking about for substance or behavioral addictions. Now, of course, this process of abstaining from thoughts or removing the addictive nature of certain thoughts can definitely take some time. So to really get close to the nature or the underlying basis of that intrusive thought. And I raise this because a lot of times the intrusive thought is not, okay, I'm thinking about a car accident, or I'm thinking about a breakup, or I'm thinking about an exam that I have. That can be intrusive, but a lot of times it's some kind of nebulous, abstract set of words or ideas or images around something that happened that we saw or heard or experienced. And by putting a lot of clear structure to what the thought is exactly, and to putting some thought and structure onto paper about what that pattern of not healthy thinking relates to, people often achieve tremendous relief in a fairly short amount of time. Sometimes just in one session of writing it down. Sometimes they need to write it down multiple times. What you're essentially trying to do with a intrusive thought or a trauma of any kind is you're trying to turn a disturbing story, that is a story that evokes a lot of emotion and captures, it kind of hijacks your nervous system, into what is essentially a known but repetitive and kind of old, boring story where the emotional load has been depleted. And there, of course, I have to highlight the fact that getting sufficient rapid eye movement sleep, we also know, is very important for removing the emotional load of traumatic experiences and intrusive thoughts. So you really want to strive to get the best possible sleep you can that includes sufficient rapid eye movement sleep. So in order to remove intrusive and addictive thoughts, ask yourself, is this OCD of the classic sense? If it is, you should see a psychiatrist. They won't necessarily prescribe medication, but there are tools for true OCD that are very effective in many cases. You want to ask yourself, are the thoughts disturbing or merely intrusive and repetitive? If they're merely intrusive and repetitive, well then learning to focus your attention on other things and getting better at focusing on single things through an exercise like mindfulness meditation can really help. And indeed, perhaps the best use of mindfulness meditation is to improve your level of focus. It does have other benefits as well, but that's going to be the major one that one will experience even with these very short 5 or 10 minute a day meditations. Great data on that from the scientific literature. And then if those intrusive thoughts are not only intrusive, but they're also disturbing, in that case, you really want to put as much structure and thought, believe it or not, into what those thoughts are really about. Write them out on paper in complete sentences, and maybe do that multiple times until the underlying emotions related to those thoughts really start to diminish. And by doing that, you're essentially doing your own form of trauma therapy, for lack of a better way to put it. And again, the data really point to the fact that getting close to the specific details around those intrusive thoughts is going to be the best way to extinguish them.